I am joined today by Patrick Bergstrom, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know this past year. He has been leading engineering teams at companies such as Best Buy, United Health Group, Stormforge, and most recently has been a founding member and CTO of CultureKey, a consulting practice aimed at helping organizations with bringing in on-demand leadership and culture-oriented solutions. So Patrick, thank you so much for joining me today on Cupalo Conversations.
Yeah, hey Lauren, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it. This should be fun.
Me too. Well, so I want to talk to you today about culture. Edward Schein once famously said, "A company does not have a culture. A company is a culture." This is a word that is so often used, but is so rarely defined. And I would love to know, what is your definition of culture?
Ooh, that's a great question. You're coming out swinging, huh? Um, for me, um, culture is all about ultimately it boils down to the concept of how work is getting done, right? Culture is the defining characteristics that essentially guide or should guide everyone in an organization around how they accomplish their work every day and what that means to not only them, but also how it ties back to the mission of the organization and making sure that, even down at the lowest layers of an organization, they're thinking about what the mission of that company is, how they're making decisions, how they're, showing up to work every day and accomplishing the tasks that they're setting out to accomplish. It should be the absolute core and foundation to any organization.
No, that's a great answer. I think that you could ask 10 people and get 10 different answers, and that's what makes it so difficult. I think that that's also a component of how the human brain works. The most significant things are often the hardest to describe, like love, for
Yeah.
example. So,
Yeah.
going back to this idea, though, about a company culture, I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, I've only been working in corporate America for 10 years, so my vantage point's pretty limited, but it feels like it's become a relatively new phenomenon in corporate America to really seek to define a mission, define culture, core values. Is it really as new as I think, or is this something that's been going on for 15, 20, 30 plus years? And if it is new, why now?
Yeah, I don't think it's new per se. Any good organization, in fact, one of my favorite motivational speakers and authors and consultants, Simon Sinek, talks about this concept of starting with why, right? Like every organization should have this core idea of why they do what they do, which ultimately leads into how they do what they do and then executing against that. So it's not new. He gives a lot of really great examples of organizations like from back in the 90s that both did not have a set mission of why they do what they do. And then a bunch of really good examples of organizations that do, like Apple, for instance. I think ultimately what it comes down to is that organizations are realizing that if they can communicate and demonstrate to employees why that organization does what it does, and it's a real thing that employees can get bought into, that's ultimately what leads to the success of an organization, right? It's one thing for somebody at the top to say oh, we want you to have fun at work every single day, right? But then when you get 9, 10 layers removed from a CEO and you've got a manager who does not believe that and is just trying to drive you into the ground because he thinks that he needs to be like a total jerk in order to be able to manage people or a boss, there's a disconnect. And I think what we're seeing is a shift in organizations, especially large corporate organizations, where they actually do understand that maybe they have the right intentions when they're talking about their mission statement, how they do what they do or why they do what they do. But the culture of the actual organization doesn't always reflect that. And so putting an emphasis on driving culture that actually supports that mission and that vision does lead to better productivity. It increases profitability, it increases the productivity of the organization. And frankly, if people enjoy coming to work, then the benefits of that are nearly limitless, right? Everything from lower turnover to higher productivity to better conflict resolution, all the way up to, which leads into better ideation scenarios or situations where you can have 30 people in a room from disparate levels of an organization that can have an open and honest conversation about an idea. Because one of the things that I've always believed in, especially when it comes to things like software engineering, is when you get into a room, if you can have an open and honest conversation about the drawbacks and the benefits of maybe going down a particular path, and it's 10, 15, 30 people that are having a healthy discussion on why something might work versus something that might not work, rather than having what in some circles would be called a toxic genius that is trying to yell at the room saying, no, this is how it's going to be done because I said so. The outcomes are completely different, right? And in that toxic genius scenario, if that toxic genius is a hiring manager, for instance, they're more likely to hire people that think like them. And so they hire for what you call culture fit, to make sure that people will fit into the culture that they've created. And then you just get a bunch of yes men and yes women in a room that say, yes, sir, boss, that sounds like a great idea. And then nothing is ever really invented, right? Versus when you have that healthy conflict resolution capability, the sum or the idea that comes out of that room ends up being the sum of all the parts of the discussion, which gives you, that's where innovation comes from. That's where creating ridiculously highly scalable, highly available architecture comes from. When anybody can contribute to that conversation and just ask a question about what they perceive as a potential risk, that's where the ideas evolve and become something greater than any one single idea.
So do you think that outside of the different levels of the organization representing and having the experience of a company culture, do you think different skill sets? So Amazon, for example, I just finished reading Ben Horowitz's The Hard Thing About Hard Things, and he goes on to describe how initially Amazon used doors for desks, and it was emblematic of the mission to save money, to give back to the customer, to not spend money on these big expensive desks for the benefit of the consumer. But does the Amazon delivery driver and the Amazon software engineer have the same experience of a company culture?
Yeah, no, definitely not. And I think that's relevant in the media today, especially, right? And that's one of those things where it's hard because I'm going to try not to go down the path of talking about how every great invention is built on basically free labor, right? But that's the price that I think that's the price that Amazon is willing to pay in order to be able to get you that tomato within 3 hours of you ordering it, right? I think it's a completely different conversation that should be had, frankly, on whether or not we really need to have a tomato delivered to our door in 3 hours. The convenience factor is huge. But in that situation, I would actually argue that it is probably untenable for the warehouse worker, the delivery driver, even like the freight driver, in order to experience the organizational culture that a software engineer would experience. And that's kind of one of the challenges that you run into when you get into these behemoth organizations, recognizing the various layers or levels of it, and then really truly being able to make a decision on what is the policy for breaks at the warehouse and how somebody is measured, compared to the policy on breaks and how somebody's performance is measured as a software engineer. And that actually is a really good example of why, in my opinion, I mean, going back to your question, there are different skill sets required. And I think when you build a team in particular, that's something that you have to be aware of. Because in the past, especially relevant to software engineering, it's always been very common to take your highest performing software engineer and make them a manager. And I think that in the last 10 years, we've kind of learned that that's not necessarily a good thing, because the behavioral traits that make most, I won't even say most, I'll say some of the best software engineers in the world. And now they're getting better at self-recognizing that maybe I shouldn't be a manager. But some of the best software engineers in the world that I've had the pleasure of working with, they don't necessarily have the skill sets to be a really good manager, right? Because being a good manager requires difficult conversations, frankly, in order to be able to drive productivity, and drive, frankly, career decisions for these individuals that maybe they're in the right spot, maybe they're not in the right spot, whatever that looks like. But then also at the same time, being able to manage an entire team and understanding what good management looks like and good leadership versus managing to a metric, right? And that's something that I think the warehouse example for Amazon is a really good example. I think it's very well known that they manage to very specific metrics. And if you don't meet those metrics, then you're not going to cut it, right? And in a lot of ways, the work that they're doing is, like, I'll say, robotic, right? And so it's all about trying to figure out how to get them to move more packages faster, which that is very difficult, I think, to align that to a company culture and have the individual that's performing that role be excited about that role, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. I wonder if, another thing that seems to go hand in hand with culture is core values. And I wanted to talk more
Mm-hmm.
about that today because it's become, sort of commonplace that core values are plastered on the wall at a
Mm-hmm.
headquarters. And is our core values a building block of culture? And I guess if not, then what is their direct relationship to a culture? How does a company even go about proclaiming these are our core values? Every person here should be, exhibiting them.
Yeah, I think done correctly, core values absolutely are an integral part of the culture, and it should be an integral part of leading somebody to make the right decision in a moment that best serves the organization's culture and what they want to go after, right? So a core value, I think, is important. I think it is one of those things that you should make sure that your team understands. But it's also a very risky endeavor because if you're providing or creating these core values and from internally it's just perceived as lip service, then it's not going to go anywhere and you're not going to really have any sort of culture to build off of that because nobody cares. They know that really what you care about is the bottom line, the profitability, and sending, getting more money into the shareholders' pockets or whatever that looks like. You should really only have core values that align with your business if you truly believe that those are your core values and you truly believe that those are more important than the profitability of the organization.
That's really interesting. I think that it's something that, again, frequently gets a lot of lip service to your point,
Mm-hmm.
but it's
Mm-hmm.
rarely actually exemplified. And I think you
Yep.
can see it. I mean, you mentioned big organizations have a lot of warts, right? Like that's my language, but it can be
Yeah.
really complicated. I think even at really small companies too, where they're founder led and the founder is there every
Mm-hmm.
single day, you get to see how they show up and it can feel very much personal to them. Are they exemplifying the core values? The old expression, shit rolls downhill.
Yep.
So I think it can be really challenging no matter what size the organization is to hold that at the forefront and know that's why we're coming to work every day. With that in mind, the idea of coming to work every day. So I talk to a lot of people being in recruiting. I talk to a lot of people who are looking for their next opportunity. And
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with you that, people do want to be a part of an organization that is mission driven. That is actually something that frequently comes up right off the bat. They want to be a part of an organization that's mission driven. But at the end of the day, when you get further down into what they really need, we go to work, we show up to make money. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we're, feeding our families, feeding ourselves, putting a roof over our head. And I think people can feel at conflict at times personally with, I need to go to work to make money. That's why I'm doing this. But I do want to work with good people and solve interesting problems. I want to feel like I belong. And I'm wondering, is there an opportunity for people to maybe reframe this that it isn't mutually exclusive? You can, go to work confidently, wanting to make great money, and you're worth it. And it's part of the culture actually to pay people well and to validate
Yeah.
their skill set. And I'm curious if, again,
Mm-hmm.
I do feel like people sometimes look at it as so binary.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's one of the things that I personally have always fought for. And this, I think, this is one of those moments that we're probably in the last 5 years we've been having this moment in corporate America where people are finally starting to openly discuss salary, for instance. I think that in the past, certain leaders in an organization, from the manager level all the way up to the higher executives, they tend to want to make sure that nobody talks about salary, like because that's a tool that they have to drive profitability and everything else. But to me, I think that's always been comical, right? Because if I'm not paying you enough, then you're going to go find a job somewhere else where you are getting paid enough. And especially if I'm in an organization where maybe the work that we're doing isn't super rewarding, or there are other pieces of it where they're just not getting that satisfaction out of it. It really is a balancing act where you're going to have to pay them just a little bit more to do something that's undesirable that they don't want to do, but you need their talents, right? And I think the biggest mistake that we can make as leaders is, first of all, not recognizing or paying somebody what they're worth. And then two, ultimately not having that conversation with that individual, especially if they're somewhere in that pay bracket that you know is incorrect, right? And I think this is one of those things that I picked up probably a decade ago now at this point, but I've always had open and honest conversations with my people, especially as it relates to salary. And that's one of those things that I believe from a culture perspective that drives trust and awareness, and it drives loyalty, frankly. I had an individual that was getting paid in like one of my organizations. I think he was something like 50% below where I thought that he should be. Like, it was comical. And I straight up told him that he needs to find a job somewhere else because, like, I think that he could be making X, and I will commit to him to try to get him there, obviously. But in a big corporation, like, it's really hard to adjust pay sometimes. And he appreciated the loyalty and the transparency that I gave him so much that he stuck with me for over a year. And we ended up getting him pretty close to what I thought was accurate of where he should be, which is great. And it's a huge win for me. But it's always been so weird to me that an organization is okay with underpaying somebody, because in the end, it's going to cost me probably 50% of somebody's annual salary to hire, train, and retain somebody to replace that individual. And so, especially if I have an individual that's outperforming or performing above where I think that, I would expect from their current pay grade, I'm going to make sure that I pay them appropriately, first of all. Bottom line be damned. And then secondly, though, that's the type of thing that will inspire them to not only stick with me, but then also it makes recruiting and retention easier for me, because then when I post a job, that individual will go out and share it on LinkedIn and literally say, trust me, this is who you want to work for. Which is always like the ultimate compliment for me when somebody does that. And it proves to me that I think culture does matter more than people used to think that it does. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, and I think it does. There's a couple of questions that came to my mind as you were talking, and it seems like one of the big challenges, and that's not just at big companies, but small companies, is when somebody wants more money and there's justifiable evidence to say that they deserve it, be it market analysis or it's, their salary bands they know exist at that company. And frequently what ends up happening, often a catalyst for this, is that an outsider, someone from another, company comes over and comes in higher of a salary than that person, and maybe is at a lower level even, or even lower domain knowledge because they haven't been with that organization. And that those people talk, that often happens. And there's this aha moment of, whoa, if I had only come in from the outside, I could have commanded a higher salary. Being here, though, I can't ask for a 20% increase because that would be ludicrous. But it isn't ludicrous for our company to pay that type of increase to someone coming in from the outside. That does seem to be a big and persistent problem. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that, especially at obviously larger organizations that have well-established HR policies and practices will often have rules that say to go from this grade to this grade, it's a 12% increase, right? Which that's how you get stuck in that situation where you're 50% below what your market rate is. And I think, in fact, that individual, I believe, had worked for this company for something like 7 or 8 years. And that's one of those things where, like, again, I will be transparent and tell them the best way to get a raise to where you should be is frankly to leave and then come back in 2 years once, if you really, really, truly like working for this organization. And so sometimes they'll stick it out, sometimes they won't. But the inverse is also true, where you'll have individuals that maybe aren't worth that think they are, because that's what the market is demanding. And again, that's where having honest conversations with people regularly, whether that's a weekly one-on-one or a quarterly check-in, where you're doing reviews of their performance or whatever that looks like. A review in that conversation, especially around salary, should never be a surprise to the manager or the individual. If you ever, and I think one of the things or the example that I like to give to my managers in particular is, if you give a quarterly review to somebody and they submit their self-guided or self-scored reviews, if y'all are off by 1 point, like, something has broken down. Like, you as a leader are failing that individual because they think they're performing at a 4, but you think they're only at 2.5 because they're barely meeting expectations, right? And so that tells me that you are not communicating to them effectively that they're not meeting expectations. And frankly, the inverse is also true. Especially, we talk about imposter syndrome in software engineering a lot. Um, if somebody is rating themselves a 3 and you're rating them a 4.5, then you're not reminding them or providing them positive feedback enough. Because some people, like yours truly, thrive on positive feedback, right? It's one of those things where ultimately I think communication is key to not only ensuring that everybody's on the same page, but as much as we talk about culture and as much as we talk about mission statements and vision statements and all that fun stuff, if you're not communicating that effectively to your organization, they will not believe that you actually believe it, and it will all fall apart.
I agree. I think it goes hand in hand too with people feeling like they really belong. I guess I wanted to
Yeah.
talk more about that too. How does a leader, I have two questions here. How does a leader cultivate a sense of belonging? And do you think that hybrid, not 100% remote and not 100% on-site, but do you think hybrid models are actually in conflict to that? Because when you have teams that are 100% remote or 100% on-site, it's a level playing field. Everyone's having the same experience of that corporate office. Where you have a hybrid model and some people are in different states and others are going on site and somebody's sitting on a Zoom and someone's in a conference room. I'm wondering, how does a leader cultivate a sense of belonging? And does this hybrid model challenge that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that's a really great insight. I think hybrid can work depending on the organization, but it's something that you do have to be very active at cultivating and making sure that you're including people that are not in the room in the conversation. Um, in 2014, 2015, I had an individual in one of my organizations. It was a smaller team, just like 10 people, if I remember right. One of them wanted to move to northern Minnesota to be closer to family. And this was before remote work was a big thing, right? And I fought for that individual, and I approved it, and we got it to happen. But it was something that we were very aware of, and so within my organization and that team in particular, like we made active efforts to ensure that we were calling them on calling on them in a conversation. We were soliciting them for ideas, because as somebody that's on the end of a webcam compared to a room full of 8 people, it's really easy to get forgotten about, and it's really easy to get pushed out, right? And so if you're going to try to do hybrid, it's just something that you have to be actively aware of, and you frankly have to conduct your meetings just a little bit different, right? In most professional environments, especially when we're all together in a physical location, it's easy to let the conversation kind of naturally happen. But if you've got 1 or 2 or even up to 50% of the staff that's not in that room, it becomes very easy for the conversation to take place in the room and not on the web conference, right? And so if you're conscious of that and you build that awareness and you build capabilities within your meeting practices where the people in the room can chime in, they're not getting stepped on, and we're able to have those conversations and participate in them fully as if they were in the room, then it absolutely does work. But it is something that you have to work at, and it's not easy, frankly. That being said, though, too, with 100% on site, the inverse is also true in that I've been in organizations where, I had an office in multiple buildings downtown Minneapolis, or not downtown, but in Minneapolis. And all I did was I sat in my office and I sat on WebEx calls all day, right? And it's like, so why am I here? Like, I can do this from home. I don't need to be here. And it's just being aware of, what are you asking from your staff with regards to your work model, whether that's in office, hybrid, or 100% remote, and what's the real driving force of that? One of the organizations that I worked at, we shut down for COVID and went fully remote. And then we had a town hall meeting where we talked about this was the best, most productive quarter that we've ever had. And then the very next topic in that meeting was, how are we going to bring everyone back to the office, right? And it's like those two ideas are so diametrically opposed. And the evidence is literally right there. And so I think that's where making data-based decisions is just so critical when we talk about culture and leadership, and being able to ensure that the conversations and the decisions that you're making and the strategy that you're following is for a legitimate reason based on data, not because I just spent $100 million on this building and I want to see people in it at 4 p.m. on a Friday, right? or
Yeah.
because the CEO is lonely and they want to go to the office every day because they have nannies that take care of their kids. They have a service that drives them to the office. Like, it's easy for them to commute. But when you've got somebody that lives 20 miles away from the office in downtown Minneapolis, and they have to leave at 7 a.m. and they've got 4 kids at home, and then they're in the office till 4:30 because that was your mandate, and so then they don't get home till 7 p.m. Like, an individual or leaders should really think about how they're showing up and what they value as a leader is being communicated to their employees, because that's how you tear apart an office. That's how you get people to move out, employees that just don't feel valued.
Yeah. I think that those are all excellent points. I don't think it's wrong. Like, I don't think like there's some moral issue here of companies if they wanted to bring everybody back, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
100%, but having that
Mm-hmm.
transparency and then giving people, I mean, ultimately, we have a choice. We can choose to work at that organization or not. I
Yeah.
think being clear is really important. I do think I love working remote. I don't think webcams are a substitute for human connection. I
Right.
also, I don't try to get all of my satisfaction from my work. I have other things that fill my bucket. And I notice a lot of times
Mm-hmm.
the happiest people, there's a balancing act. They've got, more than one thing. So it isn't easy. I think it's not all in the
Yeah.
leaders. I think also employees have a responsibility to advocate for themselves and ask
Mm-hmm.
for what they need. So um, my last question to you today, as we are at the beginning of a new year, what is top of mind for you in 2024, either with CultureKey, with your other businesses, personally, but what is top of mind for you this new year?
So I think for me, 2024 is going to kind of continue to be an extension of 2023, which is really putting myself more into what I consider like that service to others type of culture, because that's what I believe in, and that's a big reason why I agreed to start CultureKey with my partners, right? Because for me, there's a couple different things that immediately come to mind. Like, one, I care more about the individual contributors and their success than I care about the profits that an organization is making, right? And I do actually believe that the two are intrinsically linked, though. If you have employees that are happy, they believe in the work that they're doing, they think that they're well compensated for it, they're going to show up to work every day and they're going to work their butt off for you, right? Which in the end will help drive profitability and success of the organization, which is great. But I think it should always be leading the individuals first in order to achieve those results, not starting with trying to figure out how you're going to achieve the results and then taking it out on the individuals to better drive results, whether that's through layoffs or through lower compensation packages or what have you, right? So for me, it's acts of service towards other organizations where I can teach them some of this stuff, and then help to see and drive those successes, whether that's through employee engagement surveys, culture surveys, or even just reducing meetings by 20% and saving hundreds of thousands of dollars a week in labor, right? And that kind of reflects back on some of the other organizations and the other businesses that I help with too, is being in service to either your individual contributors, if you're like a technology organization, or ultimately being in service to your customers, first and foremost, if you're in the business of interacting with public customers every day. So with our retail stores, it's the same thing. I always tell folks that work for us in our retail stores, you're not here to make a sale, right? Like, somebody is walking through that door because they're on a mission for something. And so your job is to help them solve whatever problem they have. And then if we happen to make a sale as part of that, perfect. That's great. That's what I care about, because nobody likes going to a store where you've got pushy salesmen that are trying to shove the latest and greatest thing on you, right? But if I can walk into a store where I trust the individual that's providing me with advice and I trust them to give me the thing that I actually need to accomplish my task, I'm going to go back to that store every single day. And I think the same thing is true in an organization, whether you're in a tech organization or a healthcare organization or a retail organization. Um, Being able to trust your leaders, that they have your best intentions at heart as they lead you through whatever challenges an organization is going through, or a culture transformation, for instance. um, that provides a much happier, a much healthier work environment, And so for me, I think a lot of 2024 is going to be helping leaders unlock the potential of their organizations through creating those positive interactions, through creating a positive culture. And frankly, teaching leadership that it's not all about the bottom dollar all the time. Like if you put your employees first, the bottom dollar will be a very close second and it will naturally follow.
You mentioned Simon Sinek earlier, but
Mm-hmm.
he frequently talks about playing the long game. And that is a long game play where you're
Yeah.
not just trying to make a quick buck or squeeze
Mm-hmm.
every ounce of juice out of your employees. There's a longer term vision. I think that's oddly countercultural. We have a lot of pressure to hurry up and make the quick sale. And so I wonder, have you drawn also on Simon Sinek for this specifically about, customer service, of real employee service too?
Yeah, a little bit, and I think that he is spot on when it comes to that long game, right? Like especially if you look at layoffs, for instance. I think a layoff is the perfect example of an organization falling short and not thinking about what the long-term consequences look like. For me, the culturally, I think it's really important that customer or employees feel psychologically safe, which is something that you had talked about earlier too, in establishing trust. One of the best ways to do that is through creating an organization that is, I don't want to say sheltered from layoffs, but it's structured in such a way that the work that everybody is doing matters, and nobody is really doing like that fluff work that you can afford a layoff, frankly. Um, the right time to do a layoff is if you are stopping work in a very particular direction because the business needs have shifted. Like that's totally fine, right? But if you are suspecting an economic downturn or you just have a feeling that you need to cut labor to drive profitability, like that's not acceptable. Because in the end, innovation and productivity is going to suffer through the loss of not only the direct loss of the individuals that you laid off, but then everybody else that got left behind is going to be wondering for the next 6 to 9 months if they're next. So their productivity is going to go down. They might start looking for jobs. And then when you turn around and have to rehire them anyway, or somebody to fill that spot because it turns out you didn't want to stop the work, you just didn't want to pay as many people as you're paying them, there's direct consequences to that. Whether that's it takes now an extra 12 to 18 months to accomplish a particular piece of innovation that you were going after, or if you find yourself in a situation or a scenario where like you do have to immediately rehire, that's still 6 months worth of trying to source, trying to find somebody, and then getting them back up to speed about the organization and the mission and everything that you're trying to accomplish. And just hope that they aren't aware that you laid somebody off 6 months ago in this exact job, because they probably won't take it if they find that out. So yeah, it's one of those things where I think culture and how your leaders show up every day and the decisions that we're making every single day literally affects every aspect of the organization. And so if you're not rooted in culture first, the entire organization suffers. And frankly, I think there is no long game.
I really appreciate your insights. Like I said, this is a topic that often I don't think really gets as much as the word culture is used. I
Yeah,
don't think it really gets the type of attention and cultivation and
I
care
agree.
and feeding that it really needs in an organization or even an individual level. So I am so grateful, Patrick, for all of your insights, for sharing a lot more too of your journey and what you've experienced in corporate America and starting CultureKey. And I'm so excited for what 2024 holds for you. I think there's a lot of work to be done. You've got your work cut out for you, I should say, in this regard. So
I hope so.
well, thank you so much again for joining me today on Cupalo Conversations, for all of your insights and for being in my orbit.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. This has been a blast. It's been fun.